This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Again, Erev Shabbos Rabbi. This Shabbos is Tisha B'Av. But as the Gemara tells us in Masechet Megillah and Hayamid Beis, Bikesh Rabbi Lakar Tisha B'Av. Rabbi wanted to be Oikar Tisha B'Av. And the Gemara asks, how could he be Oikar Tisha B'Av? It was a year like this that Tisha B'Av came out on Shabbos, and Rabbi said, once we're pushing it off, let's get rid of it. So hopefully this year the Shita of Rabbi will come to fruition, and we could be Oikar Tisha B'Av. But let me share with you, we're going to review maybe the most famous Gemara in Shas. We learned this so many times. And we're going to say Chidushim Noiraim on this Gemara. It will be Ki'ilu, you never learned this Gemara before. So it goes like this. Kamsa Ubar Kamsa. You ever hear these people?
Yes.
Kamsa and right, the Gemara says Kamsa Bar Kamsa Charav Yerushalayim. It's not on your sheet. You're supposed to know it by heart. Dahu Gavra Derachme Kamsa. There's a guy who had a friend Kamsa Bal Devave Bar Kamsa, and he had an enemy Bar Kamsa. So what do you learn from here? Don't have a friend and enemy with a similar name. Yeah? Avad Sudasa. So he made a party. Amar Le Lashami told his attendant, Zil Aisili Kamsa, go get Kamsa, Azal Aisili Bar Kamsa. Bring Bar Kamsa. What do you learn from here? Get a competent shamus. Yeah? Asa Ashkeche. He went and he found the Hava Yosef. He comes, the guy who makes the party, he sees Bar Kamsa there. He said, what in the world are you doing here? I don't like you, get out of here. Come puk, leave now. See, one good thing they had back then is they weren't hypocrites. I don't like you, leave. They don't say, so nice to see you. No, we don't do that. I don't like you, leave. He said, Shavkan. Let me stay, I'll pay for my meal. He said, no, I really don't like you. I'll pay for half the meal. I really don't like you. I hate your guts, don't stay here. So this Bar Kamsa guy says, if the rabbis were sitting and they didn't protest, they obviously they give an endorsement about what happened. I'm going to go eat some winks, literally, meaning I'm going to go speak lashon hara. Azal Amar Le Kezar. He told the Caesar, Mardu b'chayudai. The Jews are rebelling. Amar Le Miyemar. Mehechi Tesi. The Jews are rebelling. Amar Le Shada Lahu Korbana. Send them a sacrifice. Chazis, and you'll see in Mekarvan Le. If they're going to offer it, you'll see they're not going to touch your carbon. They're going to think you got your dirty fingers on it. They're not going to bring it. Azal Shadar Biyadeh. So Bar Kamsa sent an animal, Igla Tosa. He sent, basically, the Kezar sent a fattened sheep. Bahadi Dekasi, while it was going, Shadabe Muma. He put a mum, Beniv Sifasayim, in the upper lip. Va'amri La Bedugan Shvayim, some say in the cataract. Basically something that for a Jew is a mum and for a guy is not a mum. Because goyim are allowed to bring karbanos, but a Baal mum is still is kosher for the carbon of a guy. The only thing a guy is not allowed to bring is something which is mechusar aver. So it's basically a minor mum. A mum that would not disqualify the carbon of a guy, but would disqualify for us to accept. Fine. So the rabbis get this carbon with a cataract or with a problem in the lip. And what they can do? They can't be makravit. Sover Rabbana Lekruve. The rabbis wanted to be makravit. Mishum Shalom Malchus. Because otherwise the lives would be in danger. Yeah? Amar Lahu Reb Zecharia ben Avkulas. Says Reb Zecharia, how could you be makrav the carbon? Yoimru Bale Mumin Craven. People are going to say you're allowed to be makrav karbanos with a mum in it. Legabe Mizbeach. So they said, okay, taka, it's a problem. People are going to get a wrong impression, so let's kill Bar Kamsa. Savar lemikdale. You're not allowed to kill people. Yeah, but if it's to save Klal Yisrael, you're allowed to kill. Savar lemikdale. Delay lezov lema. They figure, let's kill Bar Kamsa. Amar l'Reb Zecharia, yomru matamum kochim yaharig. You can't kill him. People are going to say that if you put a mum in karbanos, you get killed. And Reb Zecharia ben Avkulas basically burst the bubble of the Chachamim. He didn't let the Chachamim be makar of the carbon. He didn't let the rabbis kill Bar Kamsa. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan an v'sanusa shel Reb Zecharia ben Avkulas. The humility of Zecharia ben Avkulas, Achrivas Beitenu, destroyed the temple, V'sarvas Hechalenu, burnt down the Hechal, V'glisanu me'artzenu. So whose fault is it? It's all Reb Zecharia ben Avkulas' fault. It's all his fault. You never even heard of him, but it's all his fault. In other words, why do we have to spend tomorrow watching videos all day? It's because of Zecharia ben Avkulas. It's he, right, Sunday, not tomorrow. Right? It's all Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas' fault. Why is it his fault? Because he should have known not to tell the Chachamim not to be makar of the carbon. They wanted to be makar of the carbon. So he had this frumkeit and said, no, people are going to think you're allowed to be makar of carbonis with mum in it. They wanted to kill him. Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas said, no, we can't kill him.
Why didn't you listen to him?
So, question number one is, the rabbis, they were rabbis. There's no halach in the Torah, you always listen to a man by the name of Zecharia ben Avkulas. So if he said a ridiculous halachic argument, why did they follow it? They should have said, you're wrong. Who cares? Wait a second. The entire Jewish people's lives are on the line. You have a carbon being sent. It has a cataract in the eye. You don't think God will overlook the bringing of that carbon to save Klal Yisrael? I mean, we're talking about the entire Chur Beis Hamikdash because the rabbis could not overcome this argument of Zecharia ben Avkulas. What were the rabbis thinking? Why did they listen to him? I would say it's not Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas, it's the rabbi's fault. Not his fault. He gave the argument. They're the ones who listened to it.
Right, and they're the ones that didn't tell Kamsa,
okay, they didn't protest.
Silence was acceptance.
Right, I mean, that for sure, that they were guilty of. But in terms of, why did they accept the argument of Zecharia ben Avkulas? So I want to share with you a Yam Shel Shloimeh. The Yam Shel Shloimeh, the Marshal was born in Brisk, in Poland. Today, Brisk was in Russia, in the year 1510, and he died in Lublin on Yud Beis Kislev 1573. The Marshal came from Rashi, and he was related to many of the Gedolim in his time, the Ramah, Rav Meir Katzenellenbogen, and he served as a Rav in Rosh Hashiva in Brisk, and finally in Lublin. The Marshal was the Rosh Hashiva in Lublin, and Rabbi Yisrael, the son of Rabbi Shalom Shachna, was the Rav of the city. Many of the Gedolim of his time were his Talmidim. The Levush, the Sma, the brother Maral Prague, and some say even the Maral himself was a Talmid of the Marshal. The Marshal was a very independent thinker. This is very important and interesting to know. And that is, the Marshal did not accept the views of the Gedolim before him until he was able to trace everything back to the Gemara. He did not hesitate to argue with Rabbi Yosef Karo. He did not hesitate to argue with the Rambam if he held that they had not penetrated the sugya. Now, the Marshal disagreed vehemently with the system of learning that was being done in Poland at the time. The system of learning, which was innovated by Rabbi Yaakov Palak, was a system called Pilpul. It's very difficult for us to explain what that means, because the Pilpul we have today is totally different. Pilpul back in Poland meant intellectual acrobatics, where they would make up certain presuppositions and extrapolate based on it and make another connection, and the whole thing is based on nothing. It's just a way of training the Talmidim's mind to think and to be creative. And many Gedolim were against it. The Maral, the Kli Yakar, the Marshal was against it. The Ramah supported it to an extent, because his Rebbe, Rav Shalom Shachna, and his father-in-law, Rav Shalom Shachna, was the primary disciple of Rabbi Yaakov Palak. Okay. The Marshal was very critical of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Number one, Rabbi Yosef Karo's method was you take 2 out of the 3. The Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. Marshal said, Mehechi Tesi, you take 2 out of the 3. What kind of formula is that? Take 2 out of the 3. Well, why is the Rif and the Rosh, each one is exactly 33%? Learn the Gemara and see which one makes most sense. You can't make a mathematical formula. Not only that, one of the main things that the Chachma Shloimeh did was in determining the correct text of the Gemara. I read something this morning, I was blown away. The Chassam Sofer writes in a Haskama to a Sefer, Tzayhar Labinyan, that the Chachma of the Marshal, you know where we have the Marshal? First of all, he wrote Yam Shel Shloimeh. In the back of the Gemara, next to the Marshal, you have Chachma Shloimeh, you have the Marshal. I was not aware of this. Says the Chassam Sofer, the Chachma of Shloimeh was greater than anyone before him. Before the Marshal came along, The Shas was Malei Kimshoinim V'Tu'iyos, was full of thorns and mistakes. And the Marshal was Toireach, and he was Masakein most of the mistakes in Shas. That's why he has very few Chidushim on Shas, because he basically cleaned up the whole Shas. Right? Imagine, he came, when the Marshal came to the scene, the Shas was a mess. The Shas was like a haunted house. And he fixed it up. You want him to put up paintings also? It was enough that he took an old, shackle, an old broken down home, and he cleaned it up. When the Marsha came to the scene, he came to a brand new house. So he was able to dig in a way that people say the Marsha really digged in more than anybody else. No, the Marshal did more than the Marsha, says Chassam Sofer. I mean, I was completely not aware of this. Who could evaluate the Marsha and the Marshal? Says Chassam Sofer, the contribution of the Marshal was so great that when you look at the Masechtos that the Marshal learned, that the Marshal had not cleaned up, like Menachos and Bechayros, and the Marshal had to do what the Marshal did, he wasn't able to dig in as much. I mean, who could know such a thing? That Menachos and Bechayros, what the Marshal was not able to dig in as much as the other Masechtas. And says Chassam Sofer, most of the time the Marsha asks on the Marshal, you could answer it up very easily. Okay, so this is very interesting information about the Marshal. The Marshal had an interesting opinion about Kabbalah. And that is, the Marshal's sheet about the Zohar was that you could follow it lahalacha, that you were able to follow the Zohar lahalacha. The Marshal, although he was quite independent-minded, and he challenged a lot of Gedolim in his time, there was one individual that he had very strong love for, and that was the Ramah. Nevertheless, he also criticized the Ramah. How could you criticize the Ramah? That the Ramah was studied philosophy and secular subjects, and the Marshal castigated the Ramah in Tshuva Vav. He told the Ramah, you might be a Talmid Chacham, but your grammar in writing Tshuvas is not correct. Be it as it may, their love was very strong. However, it became strained when the Ramah wrote something called Taras Chatas, and the Ramah criticized the Marshal hundreds of times. And the Marshal did not like that, and he castigated him back.
He couldn't take as good as he could give.
Well, the Marshal, though, was a very humble person. He hired a personal Maggid, who his job was to reproach him for any wrongdoing. The Maggid would enter his home, and the Marshal would sit in front of the Maggid with complete humility. There's a story that the Marshal brings down, Masechta Chulin, that he had a candle. It was almost going to go out, so the Marshal figured, I have to quickly finish writing, and he starts writing, and he was not. He was able to write throughout the night, and miraculously the candle did not burn out. And the Marshal writes, this was to him like the miracle of Hanukkah. Okay, I'll tell you one final story about the Marshal that the Chida brings down. That in the times of the Marshal, under his Beis Medrash there was a store of a vegetable salesman. And the vegetable salesman, his name was Avram, who sold vegetables. Nobody spoke with him. He was thought of as an Am Haaretz. One day the Marshal wakes up in the middle of the night. He hears Rabbi Avram learning a sugya, be'amkos, be'bekios, and he asked him a shaila amuka. He said, what do you want from me? I'm an Am Haaretz. And the Marshal pressed him, and he pressed him, and he pressed him. And this guy opens up his mouth, and he mamish was a gadol hadar. He said, but I beg you, don't tell anyone. And the Marshal kept his word. When the Marshal is about to leave the world, his last dying words are, my mamala makim, it should be Avram, the vegetable salesman. And that's what happened. The next Rav of Lublin was who everyone thought was the biggest Am Haaretz in the city, was Avram, the vegetable salesman. So you never know, you never know. Fine, so let me tell you an incredible Marshal, and I think this will open up our eyes to understand the Shita of Zecharia ben Avkulas, and then we're going to have to explain why the Rabbanan Why? No, in other words, we'll explain why the Rabban accepted it, and then if we explain him very well, we'll have to explain why he's wrong. Look in Gemara Baba Kama Lamed Chesed and Aleph. Says the Heilige Gemara, Tan Rabbanan Uchvar Sholcha Malchus Roimi Shnei Sardiyotos Eitzel Chachmei Yisrael. The Roman government sent 2 officers by the Jewish sages, and they said, Limdunu Toraschem, teach us your Torah. So they read it, they repeated, they taught a 3rd time, and the Roman official says, we've read your whole Torah, it's all true, but there's one thing here that's wrong. You say when the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a guy, you're pater. And when a guy gores the ox of a Jew, bein tam, bein muv, you pay nezek shalim. Mimanav shach! If Re'eu is dafka, then when a guy gores a Jew, the guy should be pater also. And if Re'eu is lav dafka, then when a Yisrael gores a guy, you should be chayiv. But you can't have your cake and eat it. How could it be that when we gore you, we're chayiv, and when you gore us, you're pater? And says the Gemara Baba Kama, this is not something that you want to tell the Goyim about. That when we damage them, we're pater, and when they damage us, they're chayiv. So Tosfos asks, how are they allowed to teach Torah to a guy? You're over and asay if you teach Torah to a guy. And Tosfos answers, they had no choice.
Isn't the guy chayiv Yisrael in the Torah?
Yeah, but I'm still allowed, I don't have to give up my life not to teach you Torah. Comes the Heilige Yam Shel Shloimeh, the Marshal Reb Shloimeh Luria. I have a question. I understand we had to teach them Torah because our lives were on the line. They said, if you don't teach us Torah, we're going to kill you. So even though normally you're not allowed to teach a guy Torah, but if your life is on the line, you're allowed to teach them Torah. Ask the Marshal, but why didn't they just lie? They should have said that if we gore you, we're chayiv, and if you gore us, you're pater, and this way, Shalom al Yisrael. Why didn't they lie? After all, it's not Yehareg v'al Yaver to lie. If somebody says, I will kill you unless you lie, so you lie. Let's say somebody says, cheat on your taxes, otherwise I'm going to kill you. You're allowed to then. You don't have to give up your life. And I'm saying la halacha, now you have to always respect the law. Says the Marshal, you learn from here, Yesod Nifla, that even though it's not one of the cardinal 3 sins to lie, but there's something in the Torah that's even worse than killing and committing adultery and worshipping idols. You know what that is?
Fine.
Misrepresenting the Torah. You can't misrepresent the Torah. You can't distort the Torah. You cannot say that the halacha is that if a guy damages us, he's pater, and if we damage a guy, you're chayiv. If the Torah says that if a guy damages us, he's chayiv nezek shalom, and if we damage him, we're pater, I don't have to go out of my way to say that to you, and I could choose to remain quiet. But if my life is in line and I must teach it to you, then I must be accurate to the text. I cannot distort the Torah, not a doiraisa, not a drabana, not a minhag. But that's not Yehareg ve'al Yavar. Distorting the Torah is Yehareg ve'al Yavar. We see from here, Yesod Nifla, that you're not allowed to misrepresent the Torah. I have to give up my life not to serve idols, and not to kill, and not to commit adultery, and not to misrepresent the Torah.
Where does it say that? Yehareg ve'al Yavar, we know the 3, as you call them, cardinal sins.
Mm-hmm.
The Gemara doesn't tell us that.
Look in the Marshal. Says the Marshal, Gam Shaminon Yam Shoshim number 3, Mehai Braisa da Asr Lashanois Divrei Torah Afki Hasakana V'Chayiv Limsar Atzma Yaleh. That according to one answer in the Tosfos, that right Tosfos says their lives were on the line. Shemalchus Harsha Gazalem V'Lam Lo Yiroch Chacham Shetal Malchus Harsha Aleim. Why weren't the Jews worried that the Goyim would make accusations against us? There's nothing worse in the world to say to the Goyim that we're pater from damaging them and they're chayiv. Weren't they worried that it's going to cause shmados and charavos, especially this machas harasha? Either shneim chayavim or shneim peturim. Shma mina shemechuyavim anu limsra al kiddush Hashem. Why? Because if you say misrepresent the halacha, It's kfira. It's like apikarsos. It's like denying God's. It's avodah zarah. To change one detail of Torah is part of avodah zarah.
But didn't they change the Torah when they translated the Torah and they each made changes?
Wait a while.
Good question. Good question.
Who cares if you do it for the Goyim? What's the difference?
You're not allowed to say, cannot come out of your mouth. The same way, according to many, you can't say you're a member of a different faith to save your life. That's part of avodah zarah. You can't say and misrepresent the Torah. We do find that in the, like you mentioned, the case of Tamai, that they gathered 72 Chacham and they were Meshana. There they did it Baruch HaKodesh. So what do we see from the Yam Shel Shloimeh? That in part, we never would have said such a thing. We would have thought, Avodah Zarah is Avodah Zarah, Gil Reis is Gil Reis. But if a guy says, what does it say in your Torah? We say, if we touch you, we're chayiv. Why can't we lie? It's not Yehareg V'al Yavar, it is Yehareg V'al Yavar. Can I give you one more example where this Yam Shel Shloimeh comes into play? Where Moshe Feinstein brings in this Yam Shel Shloimeh lehalacha. Rav Moshe brings it in lehalacha. Says Rav Moshe, here's a woman. She says, look, we live in an egalitarian society. You give me a ring at the wedding. I want to give you a ring at the wedding. Are you allowed to do it? Says Rav Moshe, does it... Now we know, Nasan hiva amar hi. If a woman says, I am marrying you, and the woman gives money, it's not a good kedushin. It has to be Nasan huva amar hu. Well, if that's the case, then says Rav Moshe, will it spoil a marriage if a woman gives a man a ring at the wedding? Says Rav Moshe, it will not spoil the wedding. Look, he says, "Bedvar elu shachar shachasen kiv javas zakal nosna gam achal chasen tabas amrarin mekudash aslach v'adai lenin kedushin." Since the kedushin was already effective, and it's a good kedushin, the fact that she gave something is shtos ba'alma. The Eidim, know that she's going to give. It's not going to be mevatel the kedushin, because even if she makes a t'nai that it's only good kedushin if she gives a ring, it's like masna mashakasav the Torah. However, says Rav Moshe, it's an Isser Gadol at the wedding for the woman to give the man the ring. Right, not only is it an Isser, it's Yehareg V'al Yavar.
And after the chuppah she can do it?
Why? It's an Isser Gadol. Why? Because if we allow a woman to give a man a ring at the Kedushin, people are going to forget the halacha that the man takes the woman, and they're going to think the woman also has to give a gift for the man. So what? Causing the forgetting of a halacha, even if it won't come to kilkul, is a big problem. Especially based on the Yam Shel Shloimeh. So you'll say, no, but in the case of the Yam Shel Shloimeh, the Chachamim are distorting the din. Here, no one's distorting the din. She's just doing a maisa of giving a ring, and from there people will misinterpret it that she has to give a ring. Says Rav Moshe, to do a maisa that people might misinterpret and the halacha is going to be misrepresented, Yehareg V'al Yavar, give up your life for that. You can't do it. So what do we see from here? That even when somebody's life is on the line, you cannot save your skin by misrepresenting the Torah. I would suggest then that was the very good argument of Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas. I would suggest there's a very good argument of Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas. Why? Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas says like this: you're going to be makar of the carbon? You're right if we're not makar, if people are going to die. But if we are makar of it, then people are going to get a wrong halacha. They're going to see emanating from the Lishkas Hagazis is that we took a carbon that has a mum in it, and people are going to say, you're allowed to be makar of a carbon with the mum. But Klal Yisrael's on the line. So what? There's a halacha over here. The halacha is that if you misrepresent the Torah, it's a kfira, it's the Yehareg V'al Yavar. Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas has a gevaldiga argument. So why don't we kill Bar Kamsa? The same things Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas says. If you kill Bar Kamsa, don't you know the Yam Shel Shloimeh in Baba Kama that if a halacha is going to come out which is incorrect, and the halacha is going to be misrepresented, then you're not allowed to do it despite the fact that lives are going to be saved. So now the question is, now that we see that the Yam Shel Shlomo has such a good argument, and l'chayra, that's what Zecharia ben Avkulas was arguing based on this Yam Shel Shlomo, why was he wrong?
Maybe he didn't have the same mind, his rationale.
So another thing we have to examine is, why does the Gemara say the humility of Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas? It should say the ta'as of Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas, the mistake. Why are we saying that his error was his humility?
I was learning it wasn't a mistake.
Now, obviously it was. We just don't know why, right? But the first thing we have to do is we have to explain what the man was thinking, and now we have to explain why he was wrong. Says the Maritz Chios, Lo yadati ma anava hoisa. Shas should have said his excessive frumkeit, his patience, his chasidus. So let me tell you an interesting concept. The concept is that there is a difference between a situation where one person's life is on the line and all of Klal Yisrael. Why is that? Where do we see that it makes a difference? We find by Esther it made a difference. Is a woman allowed to be mezana to save her life? No. See how about Yavar. So how did Esther go in Tachat Shirish?
She apparently never had relations with them.
No, but now v'chashara avadati. She was going in baratzain. How is she allowed to do it? The answer is it's hayrasha. Who gave her the heter? Where did she get this heter from? Which rabbi? Show me the rabbi. Mordechai. You need to have groisa places to say that even though you're not allowed to do something, but eis lasis Hashem hefir tarasecha. There is a concept. It's not for me to say, it's not for you to say, but big people have the capacity, the ability, and the chiyuv, and the requirement to realize that even in situations where halacha cannot be broken, if the time calls for it, you need to act. The chachamim in those times, when they saw that carbon come in with the mum on it, they knew the Yam Shel Shlomo, they not misrepresent the halacha, but they also knew that there are times, there are difficult times that call for hefero tarasecha, and they almost had the shoulders to issue that psak until Reb Zecharia ben Avkulas meekly said, well, I don't know. Who says we could apply this hayrasha under these circumstances? Shouldn't we apply the rule of the Yam Shel Shlomo that you're not to misrepresent the halacha? Says the Maritz Chios, Ulam lefi hadin hayamuter lahakriv balmum v'karben b'zeha inyan, because shahaya sakana l'klal Yisrael. Look in the Gemara in Yuma that the Kohanim wore big day kahuna shaloi b'shas avoda, which is shatnez, because of Islas Hashem. So what do we see from here? We see from this Gemara that the rabbis were not pleased with the argument of Zecharia ben Avkulas, meaning under this circumstance, since there was a danger that Klal Yisrael would be killed and the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed, this is considered a hayrasha. So what did Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas do wrong? What was his deficiency?
He didn't realize it was hayrasha.
He too much anava. He should have had the spiritual audacity to say, you know what? Desperate times, call for desperate measures.
What about the other chachamim?
Desperate measures.
Why just him?
He was the one who burst their bubble. Lo yihirav benavshay oiz lasos b'zeh halacha l'maisa. And he was choishesh that they would be choished him that he did improperly. And he did not consider himself a gadol enough to be able to take upon himself the responsibility to give and offer this hayrasha. He thought hayrasha is only for the one or two gedolei hadar, and he's not right for this. He's not right to utilize this principle of eis lasas Hashem efiru tarasecha. That's why Chazal call it what? An v'sanusai.
This is Bayasheni.
This is Bayasheni. Anyway,
It was also Bayasheni.
he was out of the city, like we said. He was already in his safe haven.
We didn't take him to task.
He wasn't there.
No, but he said, just give me
The Gemara discusses, should he have asked for the Beis HaMikdash? And ultimately the Gemara says, can't ask for too much. Right? Okay, Rabbi says this is a very interesting interpretation of this Gemara. In other words, that if the Gemara is bringing the opinion of Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas, we're required to try to understand what was Rabbi Zecharia ben Avkulas thinking. It had to have been a valid, a legitimate svara, and ultimately it was an incorrect one, mibnei an v'sanusai, which was inappropriate. Okay, Rabbi said, wish everyone an easy fast, and Mirz Hashem, we should be zoichet soim hachamishi yeh lebeis Yehuda l'sasai no simcha.
Rabbi, you still have time for the Mashiach to come.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.